This episode is brought to you by Netflix. So Netflix is basically Santa this year. 2 NFL games on Christmas Day, streaming live. At 1 p.m. Eastern, it's Cowboys, Commanders. Then at 4:30, you've got Lions, Vikings. Midwest football, playoff stakes, and probably some snow. Watching holiday football is a tradition the whole family can enjoy. Open some gifts, grab some food, settle in, and watch NFL Live on Netflix this Christmas Day.
Introducing Meta Ray-Ban Display, the world's most advanced AI glasses. With a full color display built into the lens of the glasses, it's there when you need it and gone when you don't. Send and receive messages, translate or caption live conversations, collaborate with Meta AI, and more. Be one of the first to try Meta Ray-Ban Display. Visit meta.com/Meta Ray-Ban Display to book a demo and find your pair.
Support for Ben Franklin's World and the Doing History to the Revolution series comes from the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture and the William and Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 154 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Declaring independence from Great Britain required the formation of new governments. And in the last episode of the Doing History to the Revolution series, episode 153, we explored the rise of some of those new forms of government. But why did Americans want new governments? And how did their interactions and experiences with their old colonial governments inform their decisions to create new governments? Barbara Clark Smith is a curator in the Division of Political History at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. She wrote a book called The Freedoms We Lost: Consent and Resistance in Revolutionary America, which explores both how Americans interacted with their governments before the Revolution and how their participation in the Revolution led to changes in government and the ways they interacted with it. So Barbara will be a great guide for our exploration of these questions. And as she guides us, she reveals details about what British and colonial governments were like before the Revolution, how ordinary Americans participated in and interacted with their colonial governments, and how the Revolution changed American government and the ways that ordinary Americans interacted with it. But first, did you know that you could extend your exploration of the American Revolution beyond episodes of the Doing History to the Revolution series? The Omohundro Institute has been creating complementary resource collections for each series episode in the OI Reader app. And thanks to the generosity of cultural institutions like the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Smithsonian, and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, these resource collections contain interactive maps and exhibits, images of the people, places, and documents we discuss, blog posts, book chapters, and articles from the William and Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943, and audio clips that I just couldn't fit into the episodes you've heard. You should really check it out. The app is available for all your favorite iOS and Android devices, and you can download it for free in your favorite app store or by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/OI Reader. Ready to explore more details about government during the American Revolution? Let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us is a curator in the Division of Political History at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. She's co-curator of 2 new exhibitions at the museum, American Democracy, A Great Leap of Faith, and Many Voices, One People. She's also the author of 2 books, After the Revolution, The Smithsonian History of Everyday Life in the 18th Century, and The Freedoms We Lost: Consent and Resistance in Revolutionary America. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Barbara Clark Smith.
Well, thanks a lot. Great to be here.
So Barbara, in the last episode of the Doing History to the Revolution series, we explored how the revolutionaries went about creating governments during the American Revolution. And now we'd really like to speak with you about your work because You explore how ordinary Americans participated in the revolution and how independence altered the ways they interacted with and participated in their governments.
Oh, great. That's certainly the major interest I have, is how did ordinary Americans participate in politics? And by ordinary Americans, I guess I need to start out saying, I mean, essentially free white men, many of whom had the right to vote at some point in their lives, not all of whom, though, but who were generally understood to be able to participate that way, but also participated in rather surprising ways that mostly we have forgotten or neglected to pay attention to.
Well, I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation. Now, before we get into how the revolution changed the ways that ordinary Americans interacted with their government, it seems like we should take a step back and look at the government they had before the revolution and how they interacted with that government. Barbara, how did the imperial government of Great Britain operate by 1776? What was its structure like?
The key to understanding this is, as subjects of George III, the British king, some Americans had freedoms that they would not have after the Revolution. So we have to pay attention to the freedoms and forms of participation available to subjects in the late colonial period. And obviously, it's not the case that they don't gain any freedom in the course of the Revolution. It's just they lose some forms of participation that were important to them. So here's the setup. The government in England is made up of a king or queen, and that's obviously hereditary, although Parliament can step in and change it should need be. The king is sovereign, that is the final authority, but only along with Parliament. So the kings of the 1700s agreed they would only rule according to parliamentary law. They're not above the law. That's what Britons love about British liberty, right? They think in France, in Spain, in Catholic countries, there's an absolute power, or at least the kings claim absolute power, mainly to do what they want, hindered by a legislative body. The kings and queens of Great Britain, after the Glorious Revolution, have decided that they will only act in those ways that are acceptable to Parliament. So that's the ruling group. Parliament consists of two houses, the hereditary House of Lords, which also includes bishops of the Church of England, who aren't hereditary but appointed to that position, and then a representative body, which is the House of Commons. So that basic idea of government, that you have an executive and then two parts of the legislature, one aristocrats and the other elected to represent the people, that idea is basic to what American colonists bring with them when they come across the ocean. That's the kind of government they try to set up themselves in their various colonies.
And just how successful were the colonists in setting up a similar type of government in the colonies? What did colonial governments in British North America look like?
Well, this is why everyone loves the colonial period. There's 13 different answers to that because all the colonies are a little different. But by the end of the colonial period, by the late colonial period, say the 1760s, most of the colonies have royal governments. And what that means is the king will appoint a governor to be the executive in one of the colonies. And that'll be somebody usually not from the colonies, although that does happen, but more a career civil servant who might be governor of some English colony in the Caribbean and then moved and become governor of Virginia and then become governor of New Jersey. So most of them have that executive, and then they tend to have two house legislatures. The big problem they have is they don't have that many aristocrats. Because if you're an aristocrat, you don't have a lot of reason for leaving England and going to the colonies. However, you do have fairly well-to-do people. So there's upper house in different colonies. Some places they are appointed by the governor, and some places they're elected by the lower house. Every colony, however, does have a lower house elected by the voters who represent the people in the colonies. And they have to have that because that's the way the different colonial founders back in the 17th century up through the early 18th century attracted families to come and settle. To get settlers to come, you had to say, well, you'll have a voice in the government if you're a male head of household who owns a certain amount of property. So just like England, there's that idea that the government, at least as far as the legislative and the one element of the executive branch, will take the form of an appointed governor or executive and a relatively aristocratic or well-to-do, at least, upper house, and then a lower house to represent the people. We should bear in mind that the lower house that represents the people is never made up of ordinary people. Certainly not in England, where the lower house, the Commons, have a combined wealth greater than members of the House of Lords. So they're wealthy gentry, merchants, landowners, the great landlords of the realm. And in the colonies, the legislators might be a little more ordinary, with fewer very, very, very wealthy people. But still, you didn't become a legislator unless you could take time off from farming or have an occupation that let you take the time to go be a legislator for at least several months of a year. So even those who represent the people are not average, but they are accountable through elections to the ordinary voter.
So how did these mini imperial governments that are within each colony fit into the larger structure of the British imperial government before 1776?
Well, it isn't really very certain. That is, nobody has it really established clearly because all of these colonies had different agreements and slightly different histories. Everyone understands that England is the mother country, and everywhere that there's a royal governor, which, as I say, is most colonies, the laws passed in that colony assembly can be reviewed by the king. In practice, over in Britain, that means review by the king and his ministers in Parliament, because Parliament has to have a role. So it can be that a law passed in Pennsylvania or in Virginia or New York ends up across the Atlantic and the king disallows that law. But that doesn't happen too often, and they try to avoid it because it's so confusing to pass a law and try to put it into effect and then find out months later it's been disallowed. In general, kings didn't pay too much attention to the colonies. They were too busy with other things until the 1700s. And by the mid-1700s, they're really starting to pay attention to the colonies because there's peace in England and they're able to look at how they might use their colonies and benefit from them.
We should talk about voting. You know, today Americans vote for representatives and senators at the state and national levels, governors, and even indirectly our presidents. What government officers did colonial Americans vote for, and who was eligible to vote for them?
In the colonial-wide governments, say the government of Massachusetts Bay Colony, the people could vote for a representative to that lower house or assembly. So it's just that one member, not for the upper house, not for the governor. Now, there were a few colonies, such as Rhode Island, where the ordinary voter could vote for the governor. These are a few colonies that were ruled under a charter, but this was clearly not the desired way to have a colony as far as the British were concerned. Now, who could vote also varied, but in general, it was white male heads of households, some places free African-American heads of households, although those were small in number, who owned enough property to pass whatever the bar was. And in some colonies, that was quite high. In South Carolina, you had to own more property of more value in order to vote than, say, in Connecticut. But everywhere was the idea that an adult man should own property and be head of a household, basically, in order to have the vote. So people have estimated that actually in the colonies, they end up with a surprising number of people being allowed to vote because land is so much more available than in England. So that limits set in England, say you have to have land worth, 50 pounds British sterling. Well, not very many people in England own that, but in the colonies, more and more people could. So historians have estimated that in many colonies, a small majority of adult white men probably could vote at some point in their lives. And so it's a much more participatory system than anyone particularly planned at the outset. It just turns out that more people got accustomed to a voice. And let me speak about another layer of government, and this is really important in some colonies more than in others. But in New England, where there were town meetings, and in some municipal governments, as in Philadelphia, some places in New Jersey, New York, people could vote for local offices. So you could vote for everyone from dog catcher to local sheriff to all kinds of local offices. So that experience for some voters was one of having a voice and being consulted and being able to consent.
Now, one aspect of Barbara's book, The Freedoms We Lost, that I found interesting was that although many colonial Americans couldn't vote, most could participate in enforcing the laws that Parliament and colonial assemblies passed. Barbara, would you tell us how most ordinary Americans participated in enforcing laws?
It took me a very long time to think this through, and that's because we think of execution of the law, enforcement of the law, as something that's done when the law is already finished, right? All the important decisions have been made. People have already consented to the law. And that's because in our system now, today, we consent to every layer of the government. We elect not only legislators, but executives. So we have consented by voting to the execution or enforcement of the law. And so we think of it as kind of a technical problem. We hire professional people to do it for us. We have professional police, and we have professional district attorneys who prosecute. And that's how the law gets executed. But back in the colonial era, we have to remember, ordinary voters, when they vote, they get to consent to someone who will contribute to the legislation. They don't get to vote, generally speaking, for the governor or the execution of the law. And so the execution of the law is an arena for them where they expect there to be popular consent. So they specifically choose not to have a professional police, and they specifically choose a system in which ordinary people are a necessary part of the law. One of the key institutions in which ordinary people were essential was the jury. Now, juries, back in the day, they also were limited. You had to have the right to vote. You had to qualify to vote in order to serve on an ordinary jury. And you probably had to be somewhat better off than that to serve on a grand jury, which would indict people for crimes and decide what the problems were in the locality. But the jury trial, the petty jury, the one who actually sits through the trial and decides guilt or innocence, these were powerful institutions. And lawyers of the day, like John Adams, who was a legal scholar, he would talk about the jury as the democratical part. That's his term, the democratical part of the courtroom. The judge represents the law, the governor, the king. The people are represented by the jury. And so part of what's interesting is that juries had much more power in those circumstances than they have under a later system, the system we're accustomed to. In our world, the people are represented in the courtroom by the district attorney's office. So if I break a law or if I'm accused of that, it would be the people versus Smith. That would be the name of my case. Back then, it was Rex, or the king, versus Smith. So in that circumstance where the king is prosecuting, the popular body is the jury. And the jury has the power to decide not just the facts of the case, like this is what happened, we really think this is the version, yeah, she really did steal those muffins, or whatever the issue was, but also whether it actually constituted a crime. That is, they did a lot of the things that we have judges do today. And that was because they were worried that the judge who represented the king could always expand the category of crimes unfairly to punish people who weren't really doing much wrong. So jury duty was actually a form of political participation in this time period. It wasn't always welcomed. It could be a pain in the neck, or it could be something people tried to get out of, just as they do today because they're too busy. But it also was a form of participation in which the local people who qualified to sit on the jury could decide whether or not the defendant had broken the law. So it was a check on government, and it was a form of participation. So if you add those two things together, you have on the one hand the representation of the people in the legislature, but you also have the presence of the people in execution of the law, such as on juries.
You know, at the outset of our conversation, we said that there were 13 different governments in the British North American colonies. And now I'm curious whether there were 13 different ways of enforcing the laws within those colonies. Or perhaps, enforcement was actually pretty uniform.
It was reasonably uniform, and I haven't looked closely at each one, and I'm sure each has its own peculiarities in different colonies. But these were stable official positions. There's the sheriff, and the sheriff's duties and those of other legal officials, such as constables, they have different names. Those are pretty much the same. They're established in the British common law. And there are books for those who are sheriff and books for those who are justices of the peace about what it is that sheriffs are supposed to do and how to do it. And these are popular positions. And the sheriff isn't always beloved, but everyone has a stake in knowing what can a sheriff do or not do. And ordinary farmers were reasonably well informed about this kind of thing, because their security of keeping their property, of not being fined for things that they didn't know were against the law or they didn't believe was against the law, their lives depended on knowing that there were limits to what the legal officials could do.
And what happened if the people or the men sitting on the jury decided that a law they were supposed to enforce really didn't make sense to them or work for their community?
Well, they could decide simply that the law hadn't been broken by a specific set of actions, that this law essentially wasn't law in their neighborhood. And as you know, law depends on precedent. And under the common law, what really depended was what earlier legal suits and legal cases had decided. So it wasn't just what did the law say as it was passed by legislators and signed by governors. It was how was the law actually carried out in specific neighborhoods. It was always open in a way whether the law really applied. Now, it wasn't quite as chaotic as that sounds because a lot of laws obviously applied. Nobody suggested, well, stealing is fine. Nobody questioned that the basic premise that the law was important and it was significant to enforce it. And in fact, people had a role in enforcing it. Sometimes they would even enforce it without someone having been convicted of a crime. That is, this is what is known as the famous mobs or crowds, right? Crowds of people might actually punish someone who hadn't been convicted of something, but whom the community decided was guilty of something. By the same token, they would sometimes let off people who they maybe thought had technically broken the law, but maybe they were sympathetic for some reason. Maybe knowing the local circumstances made you think this person doesn't really deserve to be hanged for this. So there were ways simply to interrupt the execution of the law and change how things turned out. Now, I'm calling this a form of political participation. I don't want to romanticize it or suggest that we would agree with every decision. These are not necessarily our notions of justice, but they were local notions of justice at different points in time. I'm not sure that we would be very comfortable with it, but for some people, the fact that they could make their sense of what was fair and what was right felt in their society, that was an important power to have.
It really sounds like people could play an important role for their government by choosing or not choosing to enforce laws that made sense in their community.
Absolutely. To some degree, they need popular consent. That is, that's behind the decision not to have popular police. And also, it's behind the idea that you shouldn't have a standing army in times of peace. Because if you have a standing army, that's men with guns who work for the king, they're likely to be used to enforce laws that are not popular in different localities. So to avoid that, there's a very strong prohibition in English Whig thought that says no standing armies in time of peace. And that's to make sure that laws get carried out by the people and with the consent of the people. So the government, the kings, the governors, the members of the legislatures, to a degree, they're always ruling, bearing in mind that whatever they pass as a law will have to be popular enough for people to carry it out. And that's one of the ways that they are made accountable. They don't pass laws that they know no one will carry out. They understand that laws will be unevenly executed in different parts of a colony or different parts of the realm of England. And they may not like that. They may sometimes bemoan that, but they also understand that that's important as a grounds on which ordinary people can resist the tyranny of any king or legislature that wants to tyrannize over them.
Okay, so let's bring our discussion into the period of the American Revolution. What happened when Parliament passed, say, the Stamp Act in 1765? What kind of popular enforcement did Parliament hope for, and how did the American people actually respond?
That's a really central question. We all learned, and this is true, we learned correctly, that the problem with the Stamp Act was that it taxed without consent, and that the colonists all said no taxation without representation. That's absolutely true. But they also objected to something else. And I think we've maybe forgotten the something else because it doesn't fit our understandings of freedom. The something else was the Stamp Act appointed stamp masters in every colony to sell the stamps and distribute them. It also set up a system of enforcement in which accused violators would be tried not in courts with common law juries, but in admiralty courts. That is, the courts that usually made judgments about crimes at sea. And those courts only had a judge. They had appointed judges, no popular juries. So the problem with the Stamp Act was, first, it's bypassing the colonial representative assemblies, right? We have our own legislatures. Why shouldn't they pass taxes, say the colonists? But not only that, are you skipping them, having Parliament lay the taxes, you're also bypassing the colonial system of law enforcement, which would leave officials like stamp masters very vulnerable to what might happen when this gets to court. So you might be charged, but know that you would not be found guilty, or at least it was unlikely. And that's why Parliament, in passing the Stamp Act, added that provision. So it's not just saying no taxation without representation. The colonists also said no execution of the law, no enforcement without the popular presence as juries and as crowds. So the reaction to the Stamp Act, as we know, was not just one where the legislatures objected, although they all did object. They did not like being bypassed. Those tend to be the leading men we know more about. But there's also objection among ordinary people to excluding juries from the execution of the law.
Barbara, I wonder if you would tell us how these people who acted out of doors against the Stamp Act were in fact the same people who defined the course of the American Revolution. Because other scholars have said that it was really a few leaders who defined the course of the American Revolution, not the ordinary Americans that you write about in The Freedoms We Lost.
Well, certainly leaders led and followers followed. But I think there are two things we need to do to understand that. One is to think about what leading meant and what following meant. What does that really entail? It at no point entailed leaders saying, this is what we're going to do and this is what we believe, and everyone just agreeing. The leaders are at all points in a conversation with the other people around them. And obviously, some people have more power than others in that conversation. But what always has impressed me about the leaders, the supposed great men of the revolution, is that they actually seem to represent a substantial number of their middling neighbors. That is, you think of something like Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence and Congress voting on it. Part of what we now know, thanks to the work of Pauline Maier and others, is lots of localities and private conventions and committees and militias and other groups had already said by July 1776, we want independence. Here's why we should declare independence. So it isn't that Jefferson and the Continental Congress weren't leading. It's that leading meant knowing something about the society around you and the supposed followers. And yes, sometimes being ahead of them in your thinking, but by no means always being ahead of them, sometimes following. The second thing that seems important to think about is, in ordinary times, leaders tend to lead and followers don't necessarily pay that much attention. But these are revolutionary times. And precisely what makes a revolution is that it is sometimes extremely unclear who is following whom and who is actually leading. That becomes the case from the period 1765 when the Stamp Act is passed, increasingly up through 1774 when the First Continental Congress meets. It's increasingly the case that it becomes confusing at different points who's actually leading whom. So I'm not arguing that the leaders were unimportant. I'm arguing that the ones who continued to be elected and chose the Patriot side, those were the ones who were in touch with their more middling neighbors and were willing to form a political coalition with that group and to risk their futures based on that coalition with the ordinary people.
I'd like for us to continue our exploration of the participation of ordinary Americans in the Revolution and how they drove it. But first, I'd like to tell you about our sponsor for this episode, the William & Mary Quarterly. This episode is brought to you by the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of the William & Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943. In partnership with the Journal of the Early Republic, the William & Mary Quarterly is publishing a special issue dedicated to investigating the American Revolution. Why did not one, but two early American history journals decide to revisit the history of the American Revolution? Well, because as we've been exploring, the American Revolution wasn't one event, but a series of many events. Not one response to a one-sided issue, but a many-faceted response to a many-sided issue, and there's still much more to discover. For example, take Sarah Damiano's William & Mary Quarterly article, Writing Women's History Through the Revolution. Damiano explores women's letters to their husbands during the Revolutionary War to reveal that as men left their homes for their new military posts, wives assumed more responsibilities around the home, including with financial matters. Now, over the course of the Revolution, the language women used to write their husbands changed, so that it mixed the emotional with the more practical. Did these new ways of writing signify new understandings of marriage that would take hold during the early Republic and develop in the years afterwards? Find out by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/WMQ where you can order a copy of this special William & Mary Quarterly issue for a listeners-only discounted rate of just $10. Now, in The Freedoms We Lost, Barbara explores how ordinary Americans participated in the American Revolution and drove its course. Barbara, would you tell us about the colonial associations that formed during the Revolution and about how these economic boycotts of British goods actually allowed ordinary people to play an active role in the colonial resistance movement?
Sure. For most people, so we're talking about most free people, this includes women as well as men, the way that you became a patriot or took a side in this patriot movement from 1765 through 1774 or 5, that whole decade, was you might sign a petition. If you were a man, you might vote a position on different acts. You might be a member of a crowd. But the main thing you did was you formed and you joined a boycott agreement, a non-importation, non-consumption agreement. And these are agreements that had several purposes. The main idea was we will not import British imports to protest these various laws that Parliament is passing. One practical result would be it would hurt British merchants who made money off of exports to the colonies, and those merchants might be prevailed upon to lobby Parliament to change the law. And that, in fact, did work to a certain degree. But second of all was the result of these agreements on local societies, local neighborhoods in the colonies. And there, these associations or trade boycotts created real unity as well as division in colonial societies. Certainly, they created division. You either signed up for them and agreed to them and abided by them, or you didn't. What you agreed to do, essentially, was not to import any British goods. If you were a buyer, you wouldn't consume them from the local storekeeper or merchant. And you wouldn't export certain goods to England. And you wouldn't raise prices on the scarce goods that remained. So you wouldn't use the occasion to make a lot of money off of your countrymen. Instead, everyone would band together. Merchants would keep their prices low and they would forego profit. They and others would purchase from American artisans, and they would, for example, buy cloth made by colonial women and male weavers in parts of the colonies, rather than buying imported cloth. So that meant they were helping their neighbors out of debt by buying that cloth, and they were not putting themselves and the colonies in greater debt to Britain. So these agreements were very much based on, I call them declarations of interdependence, because they are very clear that we depend on each other and we will create and maintain these networks of dealing in which we will deal only with one another, that is, only with anybody who agrees to this agreement. We'll leave out even those neighbors who won't sign on. They'll come to be seen as Tories or loyalists, and we will enforce these agreements with committees. Committees are groups of men elected locally. Sometimes these were called Sons of Liberty, some of the same men who'd been involved in different things prior to this. They tended to be made up of traders and merchants, but also artisans and, of course, in the countryside, regular farmers. So lots of men could take part in these, and they together agreed on what was a violation of the Non-Importation Pact. Was this individual guilty of raising prices? Was that individual guilty of drinking tea? You weren't supposed to be drinking imported tea. You were supposed to be buying herbs for tea from country women who might gather them in farms and sell them in cities. So you had a very strong policing by the people. This is part of their ability to execute the law and to police it, of things that were technically not law, but were local agreements. So these are really encompassing associations. They start small as a response to the Stamp Act and go through 1766, and then those disband, and then after the Townshend Acts, there are some new ones, and then every step along the way, the Tea Act, all these different things that Parliament's doing that upset the colonists, there are non-importation, non-exportation agreements. And that's how most people, and certainly how women, take part. And so what's essential to patriotism at that moment for this long decade of the resistance against Britain is how you behave economically. There's an economic definition of being a patriot. You don't import, you don't export, you buy American-made products, and you don't raise prices on scarce goods. That's what being a patriot is until the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And then you add to that definition a military one. Will you sign up and fight? So to some degree, serving in the military will become, after 1775, the definition of a patriot. But that key definition for the first decade and on through the war really was, are you willing to sacrifice profit in order to support your lesser neighbors? And are you willing to keep prices down? And are you willing to put the good of this whole patriot system and network prior to your own profit?
You know, from your descriptions of how Americans interacted with their government through jury service and enforcing the law, and how they participated in the revolution through these colonial associations and boycott movements, it seems like both the law and the American Revolution were looked upon as local occurrences and acted upon with local responses.
Well, it certainly was a local event as well as a national event. And I think the connection there is there are so many institutions, primarily the world of print, newspapers, as well as other publications, pamphlets, in which people begin to read of other people in other colonies setting up their own associations or boycotts, doing their own demonstrations, having their own bonfires and burning stamps, and reading resolutions passed by other towns or counties, by other groups in different colonies, So you do begin to get a sense of a national, or at least trans-colonial identity. People are emboldened and heartened by the fact that you might be in Connecticut. You're reading that in Virginia, these planters of tobacco, who may seem to you very foreign and you don't really know them and you've never been to Virginia, but you can begin to get a sense of a shared set of values of what are North American values and not just British values. And those are values of enforcing these boycotts and following along and opposing Parliament. So it certainly does take place, as once there's a Continental Congress, in these continental organizations, as well as at the colony level, the level of, say, the Massachusetts government or the Pennsylvania government. But the colony governments were often disabled during these periods because the governors were able to simply dissolve the government, dissolve the assemblies and the legislatures, when the assembly would, say, pass an objection against a law that Parliament had passed. So the result was a lot of leadership took place at the local level. Now, leaders at the local level may also have been leaders at the colonial level. So I'm not suggesting that in saying these things are local, that poor men are running everything. That's not true. Influential merchants can run things, influential shopkeepers, well-to-do farmers. Those people are certainly continuing to lead and to be running and pushing this opposition to British government. But they are doing so sitting right next to, on the committee, an ordinary artisan or the local blacksmith or someone with less property and maybe without the capacity to vote at some point, because these people have to be included. You need to have a sense that this is the whole of the community agreeing. You need a sense everyone is supporting this, because it won't work if enough people don't support these associations. You have to be able to pass as the people of the town, even though that always means there's some people in the town who are going to disagree. Those people who disagree are, in various respects, not considered part of the people. They become seen as Tories and as loyalists. So there's immense social pressure to join up and to be part of what the majority of people or what the most active of people around you are carrying on. And it certainly is experienced locally. To a large degree, for many people, it remains quite local. Eventually, for those who join the army and those militia who occasionally travel to fight, they start developing a broader geographical sense of themselves and of their nation. But this is very much understood as specific to particular areas, at least initially. And there's a coming together or a joining, really 1775, 1776. You have to have that sense that, as Patrick Henry says, he says, I'm not a Virginian, I am an American. Now, for a Virginian to say they're not a Virginian is really an unusual thing, and I'm sure he frequently said he was a Virginian after that. But that movement of that sense of identity from, I don't just identify with my town and my colony, but I can identify with all these other colonies, that's a real achievement that's only partial and really only happens around the Continental Association 1774, and then I think very much in response to Lexington and Concord.
Now, eventually Americans decided that they were ready to declare their independence from Great Britain and take control of their government. As we know, this decision meant fighting a war and creating new governments at the state and intercolonial levels. Barbara, what type of society and government did common Americans want to create and hope that independence would allow them to create?
Well, in many respects, they thought of themselves as defending the institutions they already had. And so I'm disagreeing with many people who see the revolution or aspects of the revolution as anti-government. They are opposed to Parliament. There's no question of that. But in fact, they are defending the representative governments they have and the representative institutions of law enforcement that they have. This is what they start out defending. And gradually they come to think, well, we can actually maintain these freedoms better by being independent. Now, what happens is they end up not only becoming independent, but having to fight a war. and to finance that war. And so they never really get the chance to set up exactly what they wanted. And this is one of the things to bear in mind. Revolutions do not end in the place where people imagined they were going to go. That's what's revolutionary about them. Things are not under the control of people making plans. So right away, the different states start trying to put into practice the kind of government that they want. There's a whole slew of new state constitutions. Some of them broaden the franchise a little bit so that members of militias can vote. Some of them change the government in Pennsylvania, sets up with its state constitution of 1776. Pennsylvania sets up a unicameral legislature, no upper house. We don't want any of that. Aristocracy is their idea. And there are various other things that different states try. They only test these new governments in the context of Revolutionary War, however. So it's, for some years, very hard to completely set up what they want. They end up with the committees that had been enforcing the non-importation agreements and associations running the war and the local effort through a lot of 1775, 76. It takes a fair while for state-level organizations to get on top of things, although they immediately set them up to one degree or another. It depends where the battles actually are. New England is in a mess early in the war, and so a lot of things don't get organized as quickly as they might. And so for some time, the states are operating under the system. They end up agreeing to the Articles of Confederation, which is kind of an ad hoc way of just trying to run the war effort as best they can with very limited powers in the Continental Congress.
In The Freedoms We Lost, Barbara notes that after 1780, the revolution went from a local committee-driven movement to a movement driven by a central Congress and state governments. Barbara, what did this shift from local committees to a more centralized continental government mean for the direction of the revolution? And what did it mean for local rule and ordinary Americans' participation in their government?
Well, like many other historians, I think the revolution changed in 1779, 1780. And there are several reasons why that's true. One was the Americans had had some real military success. They had gained allies from the French and money from the French and Spanish and Dutch. And so it began to look like they were really going to win. And as it began to look like they were really going to win, they could start thinking about the government they wanted to have after that. And they became less dependent in an interesting way on popular participation. During the period 1775 or 6 through 1779 to 1780, the war was carried on by the emission of paper money. These are the Continental Bills. And the Continental Bills had value and would pay the soldiers and would pay the farmers for feeding the soldiers and pay the merchants for shipping things to the soldiers because patriots agreed to accept the money. That's what gave it value. The Congress was promising to tax or to redeem this money at a later date. So that was a form of finance. It was called currency finance that all the colonies had used for a long time. You accept the money, you can pay it in for taxes at a later date. So that's what gives it value. You know you're going to need some of this money later, so you take it. So during that whole time period, whether or not you accepted the money and whether or not you accepted it at face value as opposed to depreciating its value, that was a measure of how patriotic you were. The Tories didn't want the money to have value and they wouldn't accept it. And if you didn't accept the money, you might well be considered a Tory and disciplined by local committees. All during these years of the Revolution, the local committees remain active in figuring out who is raising prices, who is depreciating the money. So in many ways, they're continuing the values of the Association of 1774 and the agreements that had preceded that. They're continuing the definition of patriotism. Sure, you prove yourself a patriot if you sign up for the Continental Army, But for many, many people, what showed them to be patriots was they sold their excess blankets to the army. They sold the grain they were raising at their farm. They sold things, whatever George Washington's army needed, and they did so at reasonable prices without raising money to make a fortune while the soldiers were hungry. That was a measure of patriotism. So you were still a patriot based on what your economic choices were, what your social choices were, your actual demonstration of patriotic sentiment. By 1779, 1780, the money had depreciated a great deal, and it started to seem possible to raise money through another coalition, not one that depended on ordinary people accepting the money, but one that was an alliance between the patriot leaders in Congress and in the heads of the state and people with money. That is, they called it the money connection or the moneyed men, people who had capital. And those are people who might have been Tories or might have been kind of neutral or might have just not been willing to buy government bonds or lend money to government because it looked like they were losing and they would lose their money as it would become worthless. When it looked like the patriots might win the war, the smart money started to think, well, maybe we could lend money to the government. That would pay for the war. And then later, through taxation, we will get our money back. So that's a real shift in coalitions. So I call that the second Patriot Coalition. That's when it becomes less important to have the support of ordinary farmers and ordinary artisans, and more important, to have the support of the well-to-do. This is something that presumably, I would think, happens in virtually every successful revolution. I haven't looked at them all, so I'm just assuming that one of the things that happens is at some point you shift from being revolutionary and radical and move towards setting up stable central governments which can be supported with the money of the well-to-do. That's how the government will, in fact, become stable over the long run. It's one thing during time of war, people might be willing to sacrifice and not be self-interested. It's pretty hard to ask them or to expect them to give up profit and to even sometimes lose money on behalf of their country in ordinary times. That's not realistic. So savvy leaders like Robert Morris and various others said, well, what we need is a money connection. Let's get the support of the people who have money. And that starts becoming the basis of what it is to be patriotic in the 1780s. It's a different notion of what patriotism is.
Barbara, before we move into the time warp, would you tell us how the revolution changed the relationship ordinary Americans had with their government? What freedoms did ordinary Americans lose, and what freedoms did they gain?
Well, certainly there were freedoms gained. More people could vote, more men could vote, and in New Jersey, some women. Although it takes a while for all free white men to be able to vote. It takes you through much of the antebellum period for all of the states to broaden their suffrage. And probably the most important change is if you were a qualified voter, you could vote not just for a legislator in your state, but you could vote for, ultimately, under the Constitution, a member of the House of Representatives of the federal government, and all of the officials would be elected by you either directly or indirectly. So it didn't mean everyone could vote for governor, but the governor might be chosen by, say, the state legislature. So you voted for the people who voted for governor. Everyone doesn't get to vote for president, but they vote for electors, or they vote for state government that would choose electors, and those people would vote for the president. So there were many different systems in different states. There are slightly different details, but the key change was every branch of the government depended on the people, either by direct vote or indirectly appointed by or elected by someone who did depend on the vote. And there's no part of the government that's hereditary, no king and no hereditary aristocracy. So there certainly is greater participation and greater freedoms. And I want to be really clear that I'm not saying there's a net loss of freedom. However, there does become a decline in the practice of executing the law through common law juries and local crowds because people have already consented through the vote to execution of the law. And so we see a real change in the courtroom. We see in the course of the early 19th century a change in professionalization of police in different cities it starts in. And there's a degree to which execution of the law, an arena where there had been space for a local area to dissent or to bring local knowledge and do it their way, that becomes more uniform and less participatory. So that's what explains, I think, part of the disagreement that takes place in Shays' Rebellion and various other conflicts of the 1780s. You have ordinary farmers acting as they had, taking control of courtrooms, trying to prevent laws from being executed in their neighborhood. This was something that they had been able to do as subjects of the king. And now the new governments, even Samuel Adams in this case, who had been a big supporter of crowds and committees back during the pre-war years, he says, well, if you don't like things, you're supposed to vote. You get to vote and change what the government is doing, what the legislature is doing. You don't get to participate anymore. It's like you've already consented to the execution of the law and the way that courtrooms run. So my argument about the freedoms we lost is simply to recover a notion of freedom that was very important to many colonists and that colonists gathered together to defend along with representative legislatures. And yet that as citizens of the United States, without having foreseen this, they end up not able to continue to participate in that way. And that is a kind of shift that I think it interrupts our idea that there's some neat narrative where the colonists weren't very free and then they get more freedom under the United States after the Revolution. Sure, that's true in some regards for this particular group. And let's put aside for the moment others of the really unfree in this time period. But even as they're gaining things in the area of representation, they are also losing forms of participation that they had started out to defend. And that was a process of simply understanding government as representing the people. When the government represents the people, there's less space for the people to be the people. So practices of formulating yourself and your neighbors into a group that claims to be the people and that serves as a militia as the people, that serves as a jury as the people, that serves as a public watching public punishments, public hangings as the people, or that goes out and arrests felons or suspected felons for crimes as the people or the posse, those practices become unacceptable, even though that's part of the freedom that many people started out defending. In the long run, they come to think of freedom in a different way. And I think that's partly to understand that people of the colonial period, or these free white men of the colonial period in any respect, were not so much less free than their successors after the Revolution, as differently free. Free in a way we don't fully understand and we might not entirely agree with as a form of freedom. We may or may not agree with some of their ideas of what is appropriate to freedom. We think much more in terms of individual rights, for example. We wouldn't like to be the one person that is left out of the local agreement. We might want to stand up for the rights of an individual not to join a boycott, for example, or an individual not to go along with everyone else's ideas. But their idea was much more collective, much more that you gained power and that you were free as you were a member of this collective people, as you declared interdependence and dependence on your neighbors, and not just as you declared independence.
It's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been. In
your opinion, what might have happened if Robert Morris and other leaders of the Revolution had not shifted organization of the revolution away from the ordinary people who drove it prior to 1780 and toward the well-to-do and their money after 1780.
Of course, it's pure speculation, but during the war, the states did not prove to be overwhelmingly cooperative with what the Continental Congress asked. Continental Congress couldn't really make the states do anything, so they would vote and agree to raise money for the army or to set up standards for how you treat Tories and loyalists and their property. But the different states did different things, and in fact, different counties within the states did different things. So there was certainly an effort at collaboration, but it became harder and harder to do. And then as the war kind of wound down, it seemed less and less important to follow what Congress wanted. So that decline in national feeling, that decline in willingness to sacrifice for the good of the whole, to listen to Congress instead of looking out solely for the interests of your state, I think had that continued, there's a fair chance that we might have ended up, at least briefly, with separate confederacies, different groups of states maybe staying together with one another. But if you have a weak connection at the center, some of the problems that were anticipated by supporters of the U.S. Constitution might have come about. The problem was there's still Native American nations on the continent, many of them allied with France. The French are still having claims on the continent. The British retain claims on the continent. The Spanish retain claims. So this is an international issue of whether you will be able to fend off the possible claims. Maybe Britain could have come back and gotten the loyalty or defeated at war a small group of these ex-colonies. And it wasn't at all clear that the colonies would really hang together once they became states. So I tend to think that the money connection did make a tremendous difference in the national strength of the United States, both under the Articles of Confederation and then under the U.S. Constitution. There's no question that this involved some pushback against some of the most revolutionary values and the powers of ordinary men in the states. But by the same token, it wasn't clear whether individual states or the United States as a group could succeed in the international conflict and in the international contest for power. So I'm not sure what would have happened, but it's hard to see all the states agreeing to maintain a connection except out of precisely the sense of self-defense. I don't know whether the kind of sense of nationalism would have grown enough for the United States to have held together for very long.
Now, Barbara, before we conclude, would you tell us about your two new exhibits at the National Museum of American History?
Yeah, these exhibitions we're so enthusiastic about. They have opened already. They opened at the end of June at the National Museum of American History. Many Voices, One Nation is about the peopling and the different people who come together in the United States, how they become one people through different institutions and through different struggles, really about how we start out as strangers and end up as neighbors. And the American Democracy exhibition is about what happens when you decide, as the colonists did, to take a leap of faith and say, we're not going to have a king, we're not going to have hereditary aristocracy, all authority is grounded in the people. And we answer that question by showing that it raises issues that were there for the first generation and are there for us today. Questions like, all right, if the people are sovereign and we depend on their authority, who do we count as the people? How should they participate? Who should vote? And how should they participate beyond voting as petitioners and protesters and as lobbyists? Who should be citizens? And then how do you get them to participate in elections through campaigns and parties? So that exhibition is very much an outgrowth of some aspects of our great collection here in political history, but it follows exactly these questions as well of what happens when you say we're going to be governed by the people. Then you've got to determine how's that really going to work? And are you really going to have ordinary people's views and interests represented? Or are you going to continue to be a system where the wealthy and the well-born are really running things? And these are questions throughout American history.
And what about your research? Are you researching or writing any other books at the moment?
I am working on a book on what I think was the founding generation's greatest fears. This includes the great men everybody's heard of, but also some of the more ordinary men. And I think that their greatest fear was that economic inequality and the social inequality that follows would destroy the republic. And so I'm writing about that concern that they had. And they're really interesting in terms of what they think is necessary. They absolutely think a relatively equal distribution of property is necessary in order to maintain the republic. Obviously, they have tremendous limits in what they think of as equality. They're slaveholders. We know that's a tremendous problem for some of them, not a problem for others who accept slavery. But among the group that they call the people, unquestionably limited to free people, many places limited to some property ownership or to males only. But nonetheless, among that group, they are worried about inequality. And so that's what I'm writing about. I think I may call it the founders' greatest fear, because I think this is one of the chief things they worried about, and that's very pertinent to us today.
How can we contact you with questions that we may have about the American Revolution or about the National Museum of American History?
Well, for information on the exhibitions I described as well, and information and to get in touch with me, people should go to the Smithsonian website. The website for my museum is americanhistory.si.edu.
Barbara Clark-Smith, thank you for taking us through how Americans interacted with their government before the Revolution and how they participated in the Revolution to protect and change their participation.
Well, you're welcome. I think these are all relevant things to us today as we try to make a difference in our society or want to participate in meaningful ways, figuring out what are the ways that are legitimate to participate and what are effective, and what is it that the people can do? Is the vote enough? Those are really important questions that go back to the Revolution as I understand it and are with us today, too.
Revolutions do not end in the places where people think they will go. In the 1760s, ordinary Americans began participating in what we know now as the American Revolution because they thought of themselves as defending the institutions they had. Like Britons in England, Americans enjoyed the British subjects' right to participate in government by enforcing the law, and the Stamp Act of 1765 interfered with that right. As Barbara revealed, it wasn't just the fact that Parliament had enacted a tax without the colonists' consent. It was the fact that the Stamp Act also stipulated that anyone accused of violating it was to be tried in an admiralty court, and not in a local court with a local jury. As Britons, Americans used juries to participate in their government and to serve as a check upon government policies that encroached upon their liberties and freedoms. By stipulating that anyone accused of violating the Stamp Act had to be tried in an admiralty court, Parliament effectively denied Americans their right to check the government's power and to show their disapproval of laws in a customary way. Therefore, ordinary Americans took to the streets throughout the 13 British North American colonies to show their displeasure in other ways, by rioting, burning stamps, and roughing up the Crown's appointed stamp distributors. They also established non-importation associations, or agreements among community members not to buy British goods. Many Americans felt that participating in the execution of the law was an institution worth defending, that it was worth all the out-of-doors demonstrations and boycotts of British goods because this right was a vital part of their freedom. Without it, Americans lacked the legal way to check the power of British government because, as colonists and British subjects, the highest office they could vote for was a representative to their colony's House of Representatives. Of course, voting for that representative was a right only a few Americans had, but most Americans could participate in the Revolution to defend the rights they did have, and they did participate. As the Revolution turned to war and independence, the nature of government and the ways that people could participate in it changed. Instead of consenting to laws after the fact, as they had as Britons, Americans created new governments with expanded voting rights to allow Americans to consent to laws and government policies before they were enacted. As Barbara noted, the shift in how Americans interacted with their government was not a change most Americans were protesting and fighting for during the Revolution. But revolutions do not always end in the places where people think they will go. And this transition to a democratic republic, which proffered voting as the primary way for Americans to participate in their government, is the transition that, in fact, took place as a result of the American Revolution. For more information about Barbara, her book and Smithsonian exhibits, plus notes for what we talked about today, visit the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/154. Today's episode was brought to you by the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of the William and Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943. Be sure to visit benfranklinsworld.com/WMQ promo to get your copy of the William and Mary Quarterly's special joint issue on the American Revolution for the listener-only price of just $10. Finally, what does knowing how Americans participated in their government before the Revolution change how you view your right to vote? I'd love to know, so send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. In our third season of Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore some of the biggest issues dividing these global powers today. Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, China's growing military might, and also robots. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.